He opened his eyes, and the first thing he felt was heat. Not the sun, not a bonfire. The heat was coming from below, through the stone, through the soles of his feet, through his bones. Someone was holding him by the shoulder and saying that if he didn't get up right now, he'd be struck off the list. He stood up. His legs wouldn't obey him properly. The body wasn't his. His arms were thinner. His shoulders were narrower. On his left wrist was a brand in the shape of an open ring. He didn't know what it meant. He only knew that the ring burned more intensely than the stone beneath his feet. People were standing all around him. Lots of people. All wearing identical gray cloaks. They were all looking straight ahead. He looked in the same direction. In front of them was a slab. A huge one. Black. Iron spikes were driven into the slab. A tag hung from each spike. Each tag bore the name of a land. He didn't understand a single word of what was written. And yet, at the same time, he understood everything. A stranger's memory lay in his head like a stranger's cloak on his shoulders. Heavy. Not quite the right size. But his own. His name was Caden Worst. He was 19. He was the youngest heir to a house that had ceased to exist 4 years ago. He was here because the law allowed even those who had no land, no money, and no relatives left to participate. The law allowed it, but it made no promises. The man next to him nudged him on the shoulder again and said the ceremony had begun. Caden looked at the slab and counted. 198 tablets, and about 300 heirs in gray cloaks. The math was simple. Someone would leave here with nothing. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the platform. He was old. He was gaunt. He spoke evenly and without interest, like a man who had done this 40 times in a row. He said that the trial of inheritance was held once every 4 years. He said that each participant had the right to remove one plaque from the slab. He said that whoever removed a plaque would receive full ownership of the land and was obligated to turn it into a source of revenue for the crown within 3 years. He said that whoever failed to turn the land into a source of revenue would lose their title forever. He said that whoever failed to remove a plaque would lose their title immediately. He said that the order of selection was determined by the clan's standing. He said that the House of Askell would choose first. Caden understood everything at once. This was no gift. It was a culling. The crown was handing out trash and gold in the same sack and watching to see which of the young heirs would survive. The crowd parted. A tall young man with a straight back, flanked by 2 guards, walked toward the slab. He didn't even look at the plaques. He was heading for one specific one. He took it down and raised it above his head. The master of ceremonies read it aloud. The Tarn Valley, 3 rivers, 18,000 households, 40 years without a crop failure. The crowd exhaled. Someone cursed under their breath. Caden looked at the slab and realized the hunt had begun. Things moved quickly from there. House Merrick claimed the northern fields. House Olvin claimed the salt shoals. House Garth claimed the Karen mine, where gold flowed in 3 veins. Each time the auctioneer read out the figures, the crowd's hopes dwindled a little more. Caden was counting. He couldn't help but count. He watched as the plots with water disappeared. Then the plots with forests disappeared. Then the plots with level land disappeared. All that remained was what no one wanted: swamps, sands, rocks. He looked at what was left and realized his turn would be last. Not because he was weak, because he had no one. The weight of a clan lies in its people. He had no people. The wait dragged on for 4 hours. By noon, the slab had become red hot, and a heat haze rose from it. The heirs took down the plaques one by one. Some exchanged glances. Some walked away from the slab, pale-faced. One young man took down a plaque inscribed Iron Wasteland, and his own father turned away. Caden watched this and learned. He learned to read faces. He learned to read numbers. He understood the most important thing. Here, no one looks at the person. Here, they only look at what the person has brought. When 12 plaques remained, the crowd fell silent. 12 plaques remained, and 29 people. The master of ceremonies began calling out names faster. Every name meant the end for someone. 6 tags remained. 4 remained. 2 remained. The master of ceremonies called out the name, Caden Worst. He walked toward the plate. It was 40 steps away. He walked them and heard not a single sound behind him. No one wished him luck. No one called out to him. He reached the slab and looked at what remained. 2 plaques, the first one read, Dead Spit. A strip of sand 40 leagues long, no water, no trees, no rocks. The second one read, Calder Island. Caden looked at the second one and felt the ring on his wrist burn again. The steward read it aloud without waiting. He said that Calder Island was a rock in the middle of the southern strait. He said there was an active volcano at the center of the island. He said that over the past 100 years, the crown had sent settlers there 4 times. He said that not a single settlement had lasted longer than 11 days. He said that the mountain spews ash every 6 days. He said that there was nothing alive on the island. He said that the water in the strait boils near the shore. He said this matter-of-factly and without interest. He said it like a man who knows what will happen next. Someone in the crowd laughed. The laughter spread. Caden stood and listened. He didn't turn around. He looked at the 2 signs and counted one last time. Dead Spit is 40 leagues of sand. Sand yields nothing. Sand doesn't kill quickly. Sand kills slowly. 3 years on the sand means 3 years of starvation, followed by the loss of one's title. Calder Island is 11 days. 11 days is a death sentence, but 11 days is also a number, and a number means that someone did the math. And if someone did the math, it means there was something to calculate. Caden reached out and removed the second sign. The laughter died down. The administrator raised an eyebrow for the first time all day. He asked if the contestant was sure. Caden said he was sure. The administrator said that contestant Caden Worst was granted full ownership of Calder Island. He said the term was 3 years. He said the first income audit would take place in 12 months. He said the Crown was providing 1 boat and 10 days' worth of provisions. He said that last part almost with pity. 10 days. The survival rate was 11. Caden understood that too. They weren't giving him a chance. They were giving him just enough to write him off without a second thought. He stepped down from the platform, and the crowd parted before him as readily as they would for a sick person. Behind him, they removed the last nameplate. A boy of about 16, who was crying openly, took away the dead scythe. Caden didn't turn around. He walked toward the exit, his mind empty and ringing. He stepped out onto the street and looked south. Far beyond the rooftops and the wall lay the strait. And beyond the strait, a gray patch hung in the haze. It looked like a cloud. It wasn't moving. Caden stared at it and realized he was looking at his homeland. Someone placed a hand on his shoulder. He turned around. Standing before him was a girl wearing the same gray cloak. She was short. Her hands were scarred, and her eyes were very calm. She said her name was Tessa Wayne. She said she had been on the list of participants, but had been struck off that morning because her family owed money to the Crown. She said she'd seen him take down the sign. She asked why. Caden said that sand kills slowly, but stone kills quickly. She didn't understand. He explained. He said that on the sand, it would take him 3 years to see that nothing grows. He said that on the stone, he'd understand everything in 10 days. He said he preferred to know. Tessa was silent for a moment. Then she said her father had been a foundry worker and that she knew how to work with heat. She said she had nowhere else to go. She asked if he'd take her. Caden looked at her hands. scorched palms, smooth old scars, working with metal. He thought this was the first thing all day that felt like a stroke of luck. He said he'd take her. He said he couldn't promise anything. He said he had provisions for 10 days, and the land would kill them in 11. Tessa said that meant they'd have to make it in time. The boat they were given was so shabby, it was almost embarrassing to call it a boat. 8 oars, 1 mast. The bottom was patched up. 2 rowers from the docks, paid for by the crown, who stared at Caden the whole way as if he were already dead. The provisions were packed in 4 crates. Caden counted them. Hardtack, dried meat, 2 barrels of water. He counted and realized that the steward had rounded down. Not 10 days, 8.
They sailed across the strait for 6 hours. As they neared the island, the water changed. First the color, then the smell. Then the rowers stopped rowing, and one of them said they couldn't go any further. Caden looked over the side.
The water near the shore was bubbling. Steam rose from it. The rowers set them ashore a quarter of a league from the mainland on a shoal and turned away without saying a word. Caden and Tessa dragged the crates through water up to their knees. It was scalding, but didn't boil them. Not yet, anyway. They stepped ashore, and for the first time, Caden set foot on his own land. The ground was black. It didn't look like soil. It looked like frozen foam. It crunched under his boot. It was warm. He raised his head and looked deep into the island. There, beyond a ridge of black hills, a mountain rose. It wasn't as tall as he'd thought. It was wider than it was tall. Its summit was cut off, and above that summit hung a column of smoke, straight, even, as thick as a city tower. The third line glowed brighter than the first 2. It was short. It read like a verdict and a gift at the same time. The Energy Lord's system is active. Caden read it 3 times. Then the heat in his wrist subsided, and he was able to breathe. Tessa stood over him and shook him by the shoulder. She asked what had happened. He said he didn't know. He lied. He knew. He couldn't explain where it came from, but he knew. The ring on his wrist was no longer open. It had closed into a smooth circle and turned cold, the only cold thing on the entire island. Caden sat down. Lines hung before his eyes, and Tessa couldn't see them. He checked. He asked her what she saw in front of his face. She said nothing but his face, and that she didn't like it. So it was only him. So it was his. He looked closely at the lines. Beneath the first 3 was a 4th one that he hadn't noticed at first. It was dim. It said that 1 node out of 6 was accessible. The other 5 were blanked out in gray. Caden reached for the accessible one with just his mind, and the node opened. It was called extraction. The description was a single line. Conversion of free heat into storage. Below was a counter. 0. Caden stared at that 0, and the whole picture came together in his mind. All at once. In a single heartbeat. The mountain was giving off heat. Constantly. For 100 years. To no one. And now he had appeared, and he had a device that could collect that heat instead of letting it go to waste. He laughed. He laughed as he sat on the hot sand with a scorched palm, and Tessa looked at him as if he were crazy. She said that if he'd gone mad, she'd swim back. He said he hadn't. He said they had 8 days, and that would be enough. She asked what it would be enough for. He didn't answer. He stood up and walked deeper into the island. Tessa followed him because she had nowhere else to go. They walked for 2 hours. The ground rose. The black hills turned out not to be hills at all. They were old tongues of solidified lava. They lay in layers, one on top of the other. Caden counted the layers and lost count at 17. Each layer represented a single eruption. 17 eruptions on this slope alone. There were cracks between the layers. Steam rose from the cracks. Caden approached one and held his palm over it. The node in his peripheral vision twitched. The counter jumped from 0 to 1. Caden froze. He pulled his hand away, and the counter stopped. He held it up again, and the counter continued. Slowly. 1 unit about every minute. He stood by the crack for 10 minutes and reached 10. He didn't know what these units meant. He only knew that there were more of them now. Tessa asked what he was doing. He said he was warming his hand. She said it was the silliest place in the world to warm a hand. He agreed. He looked at the counter and thought. 1 palm at 1 crack gives 1 unit per minute. A palm is a span by a span. He surveyed the slope. There were no fewer than 100 cracks. And this was just one slope of one hill on the edge of the island. And in the center stood a mountain. He looked at the column of smoke, and for the first time that day, something inside him twitched, not out of fear. Tessa said it would be dark soon and that they needed to think about where to spend the night. Caden snapped out of his reverie. He remembered the 8 days. He remembered that no one had lived here longer than 11. He remembered that he didn't know why. He asked Tessa what killed people in a place like this. She answered right away. She said it wasn't the heat. She said you could see the heat and people moved away from it. She said what killed them was what you couldn't see. She said there was no fire in the foundry pit either, but people were still falling. She said it was the air. Caden understood. He raised his head. A column of smoke rose straight up. That meant there was wind up above. But down here, between the hills, the air was stagnant. It was thick. It smelled of sulfur. It pooled in the low-lying areas. He asked Tessa if the smelters ever slept in the pit. She said no. She said they always slept, always up top. Caden looked around. They were standing in a hollow between 2 lava flows. The flattest spot, the most comfortable, the most sheltered from the wind. He said they would go up. Tessa didn't argue. They climbed for another hour until it got dark. They came out onto the ridge of an old lava flow. It was worse here. The wind blew in their faces. There was nowhere to sleep. The rock was uneven and hot, but the air was clean. Caden understood why the 4 settlements had perished. They'd done everything right, everything that seemed right. They'd set up camp in a sheltered spot, in a low-lying area, where the wind didn't blow, where it was comfortable. And the air gathered around them slowly, odorless and without warning. And one morning, no one got up. 11 days. Exactly the amount of time it takes for a person to stop smelling the sulfur and decide they've gotten used to it. Caden sat on the ridge and looked down at the hollow they'd just left behind. It was dark and quiet and cozy there. There was death there. He told Tessa that they would never sleep below the ridge. Never. Not a single person. She nodded. He said that was the first rule of the island. It was a rough night. They lay on the rock. The rock warmed their backs while the wind chilled their faces. Tessa slept fitfully. Caden didn't sleep at all. He stared at the mountain. The column of smoke was visible even at night. It glowed from below, red, dimly, like embers under ash. Caden stared at that red glow and counted. He had 8 days. He had to show the crown a profit within a year. Profit is money. Money is goods. Goods are things you can sell. There was nothing on the island that could be sold. There was no forest. There was no ore on the surface. There was no water. There was no food. There was only a mountain that warmed the sky. And there was he, with a ring that knew how to gather that heat. He checked the counter. 41 units. He'd accumulated them overnight simply by sitting on a hot rock, simply by existing, just by not dying. Caden looked at the number 41 and realized that on fertile land, a person earns nothing overnight. They sleep. But here he sleeps and the number grows. In the morning, Tessa got up and said that the water in the barrel had gotten warm and that in 2 days it would go bad. Caden nodded. He'd already thought about that. Water was the priority. Not food, water. They had 2 barrels for 8 days, assuming the barrels didn't go bad. In this heat, they'd go bad in 3. So in reality, they didn't have 8 days, they had 3. He told Tessa this straight out. She took it in stride. She said that in that case, they needed to look for water today. They walked north along the ridge. Caden wasn't looking for water. He was looking for steam. The logic was simple. Steam is water. If steam is rising from the ground, it means there's water boiling beneath it. If it's boiling, it means it's there. They had to find a place where there was a lot of steam. They walked for 4 hours and circled a third of the island. Caden mentally noted every crack and every steam vent and kept the counter in his peripheral vision like a compass. The closer they got to the mountain, the faster the numbers ticked up. At the foot of the mountain, he was already getting 3 per minute just by walking. Closer to the shore, the counter almost stopped. He realized that heat had density. It increased toward the center. And he realized something else. If he could stand right at the vent, the counter wouldn't go up by 3 but by the hundreds. Or by the thousands. He didn't know. He wanted to know. By noon, they found that what they were looking for. It was a crevice 3 steps wide. Steam was billowing out of it so fiercely that they couldn't get close. The steam was white and thick, and it didn't smell like sulfur. Tessa walked up to the edge, cupped her hand, and then licked it. She said it was water. She said it was clean. She said it was as hot as a sauna. Caden stood there, watching the stream of steam shoot up into the sky and vanish into nowhere. The earth was giving up water. For free, too. To no one either. For 100 years in a row. He asked Tessa if she could make the steam turn into water. The line below the meter flashed and changed. She said the first threshold had been reached. She said node 2 out of 6 was open. Caden stopped right in the middle of the steam. Tessa was saying something about water. He didn't hear her. He was looking at the second node, which had stopped being gray. The node was called stock. Its description was longer than the first one's. Direct discharge of accumulation into matter. He didn't understand a word. He reached out with his mind, and the node opened to reveal a list inside. The list was short. Only one line in it wasn't gray. It read, point heating. Cost 100 units. Caden looked at the counter. 112. He looked at the ground. He crouched down, placed his palm on the black stone, and mentally said, yes. The counter plummeted from 112 to 12, and the stone beneath his palm turned white. Not red, white. Caden pulled his hand away and fell backward. There was a fist-sized hole in the stone. Its edges glowed and oozed. Tessa jumped up and stared at the hole, then at him, then back at the hole. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that in her father's foundry pit, the hottest spot was red. She said she'd never seen white. She said white was something old people talked about, but that didn't actually exist. Caden looked at the cooling hole, and everything finally fell into place in his mind. He wasn't gathering heat. He was gathering heat to give it back, but at a single point. The mountain warmed the entire island evenly and gently, and he could take that same heat and pour it into a hole the size of a fist. It wasn't a new power. It was an old power gathered into a fist. He asked Tessa what could be done with white heat. She sat down beside him. She thought for a long time. Then she said that with white heat, anything was possible. She said that with white heat, stone turns to slurry. She said that iron comes out of the stone on its own. She said that for this, you don't need coal, you don't need bellows, and you don't need 20 people at the furnace. She said all you need is a single point. She looked at him and asked how many times he could do it that way. Caden looked at the counter. 12. He said once a day if he stayed put. He said more often if he sat by the mountain. Tessa stood up, dusted off her knees, and said that in that case, they needed to go to the mountain. And Caden said water came first. He explained. He said it was a half-day's journey to the mountain, that there was no water there, and that without water, they wouldn't survive a single day there. He said water came first. He said the mountain came second. Tessa agreed. They returned to the crevice with the fairy. Caden sat down across from her and began to measure. He sat there for 4 hours. He sat and watched as water, which nobody needed, gushed from the ground, and he counted. 3 units per minute at the mountain. Here, about 1.5. 4 hours is 240 minutes. 360 units. He spent 100 and made a recess in the wall of the crevice. He spent another 100 and made a second one. He spent the third 100 and connected them with a channel. Tessa figured it out before he explained. She said he was making a trough. He said he wasn't making a trough. He said he was making a trap. The logic was this. The steam rises and escapes. So it needs to be directed not upward but to the side. And it needs to be directed toward the cold. There was nothing cold on the island. But there was something less hot. The northern slope of the ridge, where the wind had been blowing all night, felt almost cool to the touch. Caden spent another 200 units over the next 5 hours and chiseled a narrow passage through the rock from the crevice to the northern slope. The work wasn't hard. The work was boring. He sat with his palm pressed against the rock, waiting for the counter to fill up, then released everything precisely, and the rock would vanish as he moved his hand further along the surface. By evening, the passage was 6 steps long. Tessa sealed the top of the crevice with flat fragments that he himself had cut. The steam drifted to the side. He followed the passage. He emerged onto the northern slope and was hit by a cold wind, and droplets began to form on the rock. Tessa caught the first one in her palm. She said it was water. She said it was pure. She said people like him should be kept in the basement and never let out. Caden sat on the rock and watched as the droplets gathered into a trickle. The trickle was thin. It yielded maybe a mugful an hour. That wasn't much. It was negligible. It was enough. Because a mugful an hour is 24 mugfuls a day. And a person needs 6. He looked at the meter. He looked at the trickle, and he understood the main rule of this island. Everything here was free except time. He didn't sleep that night either. He lay on the ridge, watching the red glow above the mountain, and thought about the crown. In 12 months, the inspector would arrive. An official would arrive with a piece of paper. He would look at the island and write a single word. Nothing. And Caden would lose his title. So, in 12 months, there had to be something here that the official couldn't describe with the word nothing. Caden ran through all the possibilities in his head. Grain. It doesn't grow here. Livestock. There's nothing to feed them. Fish. The water near the shore is boiling. Forest. There's no forest. That left one thing. Metal. Tessa had said that the black stone was iron, and that it couldn't be extracted because it required a furnace hotter than lava. And he had a furnace hotter than lava. It was about the size of a fist and turned on once an hour. Caden lay there and did the math. If he smelted iron from the black stone, he'd have a commodity that didn't grow anywhere on the continent, for free. Iron is transported. Iron is sold. Iron means income. He looked at the counter. 48. He thought that all he needed to do was sit on the hot rock and not die. And suddenly he realized something else. He sat up so abruptly that Tessa woke up. The numbers were rising faster near the mountain. So the intensity of the heat was the speed. And that meant the question wasn't how much he'd accumulate, but where he'd sit. He didn't need a camp by the water. He needed a camp by the vent. And the water had to be brought to him. In the morning, he told Tessa they were moving the camp to the mountain. She said there was no water there. He said he'd bring the water. She asked how. He pointed to the canal they'd dug yesterday. He said it was the same canal, only longer. She looked at the mountain. She looked at the canal 6 steps away. She said it was 8 leagues to the mountain. She said that if he cut 1 step per hour, he'd get there in a year. She was right. Caden sat in silence for half an hour. Then he said she was right, and that he shouldn't cut 1 step at a time. He explained. He said that the closer he got to the mountain, the faster the counter went. He said that meant the closer he got, the faster he'd cut. He said it wasn't a straight line. He said it was like a rolling stone. He said the first step would take an hour, and the last step would take a minute. Tessa didn't understand the math, but got the gist. She said they should get going then. They walked toward the mountain for 4 days. They carried boxes and 2 barrels in which the water had already started to smell. Caden carved a channel behind him. Not deep, knee-deep. Just a path through the rock. Tessa walked ahead and chose a route that followed the slope. She said that water wouldn't flow uphill and that this was the only thing he wouldn't be able to force her to do. On the first day, he walked 200 steps. On the second day, 400. On the third day, 900. On the fourth day, he stopped counting steps and started counting in hundreds. His counter no longer dropped to 0. It filled up faster than Caden could use it up. He walked and cut, and the rock parted before him in a white line and cooled into a black channel behind him. She SSL walked beside him and watched it all in silence. On the 4th evening, she said one thing. She said that 4 settlements had sailed here with plows. She said that they were all looking for land on this island. She said that he was the only one who had sailed here and wasn't looking for anything. Caden asked what she thought he was doing. She said he was taking. He thought that was the most accurate word he'd heard in 2 lifetimes. On the 5th day, they emerged from behind the last ridge and saw the mountain up close. Caden stopped. He hadn't expected this. The mountain wasn't a cone, it was a wall. It filled half the sky. Its slopes weren't black but reddish, streaked with bands of yellow and white. A tongue stretched down from the southern side of the summit. It wasn't frozen solid, it was moving. It moved slowly, like honey from an overturned jar. It was red on the inside and gray on the outside. It crept up the slope, and a heat haze rose from it so thick that the air above it shimmered, and the sky behind it appeared warped. Tessa said she wouldn't go any further. Caden looked at the counter. It was rising before his eyes. Not 3 per minute. Not 10. He couldn't keep up with the numbers. The line said the 2nd threshold had been reached. It said that nodes 3 and 4 out of 6 were open. Caden stood in the heat that was tightening his skin and read 2 new names. The 3rd node was called Form. The 4th node was called Seal. He opened the 3rd one. Inside was a list, and it contained not just 1 name but 9. Caden read them, and a chill ran through his stomach despite the lava just 500 paces away. Stone cutting, sintering, casting from a mold, cost 200 to 2,000 units, and at the very bottom a line he reread 4 times. Construction from blueprints, cost 20,000. He looked at the counter. 13,000 and rising. He stepped back 100 paces, and the counter slowed down. He stepped back another 100, and it slowed down even more. He stepped forward again, and the numbers blurred into a smudge. Caden understood. The distance to the lava was the rate of income. It was all so simple it made him want to laugh. All the great houses had taken land that yielded a harvest once a year. But he had taken land that paid out every second, and paid more the closer you got to death. He went back to Tessa. She was sitting on a rock, looking at him as if he were a drowning man who'd just surfaced. She said he'd been there for a quarter of an hour. He said he'd been there for a minute. She said no. He looked at the sun and realized she was right. He'd lost track of time. He told her this honestly. He said the heat does something to your head. He said that was the island's 2nd rule. Walk to the lava only in pairs, and only by counting aloud. Tessa nodded and said she would count. Caden sat down next to her and opened the fourth knot. The seal. The description was 2 lines long, securing a hoard in a container outside the owner's body. He didn't understand it again. He scrolled, and there was only one available line inside. It was called Sell. Cost 500. Caden paid 500 and something appeared. It was warm and heavy. He spread his fingers. It was a black pebble the size of a finger joint. Smooth. Completely smooth. Caden looked at it and realized he didn't know what it was. He held it out to Tessa. She took it and immediately dropped it. She said it was hot. She picked it up with a stick, looked at it closely, and said it wasn't hot. It was something else. She said it radiated heat like a furnace through a wall. She said it was full. Caden took the pebble back. To him, it was just warm. He tried squeezing it and mentally pulling on it. The meter jumped to 500. The pebble turned icy and crumbled into dust. Caden stared at the dust in his palm and slowly realized what had just happened. He could store heat in the stone and then draw it back out. He could carry it. He could store it. He could give it to someone else. He looked at Tessa. He said that a foundryman needed a furnace. He said that a furnace needed coal. He said there was no coal anywhere within 400 leagues. He asked what would happen if a foundryman had a stone that generated its own heat. Tessa was silent for a long time. Then she said one sentence very quietly. She said that then there would be no need for a foundryman at all. Caden didn't understand. She explained. She said that a foundryman's whole job isn't about swinging a hammer. She said that a foundryman's whole job is to maintain the right heat. She said that masters spend 20 years teaching this. She said that heat is the only thing you can't buy. She said you can buy coal. You can buy bellows. You can buy ore. You can buy people. Heat, you can't. She said that heat is what all this fuss is about. And then she looked at the pebble in his hand and said that he had just turned heat into a commodity. They set up camp 3 leagues from the lava on a ridge exposed to the wind. Caden figured the meter was reading about 200 per minute here, 12,000 per hour, almost 300,000 per day. He sat there looking at those numbers, and they were obscene. He remembered the Tarn Valley with its 18,000 households and 40 years without a crop failure. 18,000 households meant 18,000 families who toiled from dawn to dusk, and from each household the crown collected a tax once a year. And here he was, sitting on a rock, doing nothing and earning 300,000 a day. The difference wasn't in the amount. The difference was that the land of Tarn needed people, while his land needed no one. The first thing he did was bring water. The canal fell short of the camp by 2 leagues, and Caden finished it in half a day. Now cutting the stone cost him nothing. He walked along the line Tessa had marked out and simply ran his hand along it. The stone gave way in a white strip, leaving behind a smooth groove. By evening, the water from the crevice had reached the camp. It came out hot. Tessa said it was fine. She carved out a basin at the end of the channel, and the water pooled there and cooled overnight. In the morning, they drank clean water for the first time in a week. Caden threw away both barrels. Their provisions ran out on the 10th day. They'd finished the hardtack on the 8th. The meat ran out on the 10th day. Caden had been counting and knew this would happen. He'd been expecting it. He wasn't afraid. He'd been thinking about it ever since he realized the count was rising even while he slept. On the 11th day, Tessa said she felt sick. She said her hands were shaking. She said she needed to eat. Caden said he knew. He untied the 3rd knot and looked at the line marked Plavka. He looked at the black stone beneath his feet. He knew there was iron there. He knew you don't eat iron. He sat down across from Tessa and told her the most honest thing he'd said in his entire new life. He said he couldn't feed her. He said he could give her water and heat and iron, and that it wouldn't be enough. He said that in 2 days, they'd both lie down and never get up again. He said he saw only one way out. He said he didn't like that way out. Tessa asked what it was. He said they had to sell it. She didn't understand what there was to sell. Caden pulled a second pebble from his bosom, one he'd made that night. He placed it in the palm of his hand. He said there were foundry pits in the port across the strait. He said they burned coal there that was hauled from 60 leagues away. He said that this pebble gives off heat without coal. He said that if it's true, they'll give him food in exchange for it. Tessa looked at the pebble and shook her head. She said that no one would buy a stone from a boy from the burning island. She said they'd think he was a sorcerer and burn him. She said that even if they did buy it, they'd come and take the island. Caden said she was right on all 3 counts. He said that's why he wouldn't be the one to go sell it. She looked up. He said she would be the one to go sell it. He explained. He said she was the foundryman's daughter. He said they knew her at the foundry. He said she could present the stone not as a miracle, but as a commodity. He said she wouldn't say where it came from. He said she would say it was an old stock from her father. Tessa sat there thinking for a long time. Then she asked what would happen if she didn't come back. Caden said that then he would die here in 4 days, and that she would be right not to have come back. He said it matter-of-factly. He didn't pressure her. He didn't beg. He simply stated the fact. Tessa stood up. She said there was no boat. Caden said there would be a boat. He sat by the lava all night. Caden walked toward the mountain, counting his steps aloud. He didn't do it just for the sake of it. He did it because he remembered how he'd lost a quarter of an hour standing by the lava. Speaking aloud was the only way to notice that time was passing. He reached the ridge in 2 hours, sat down in his spot, and began counting. The counter went up. 200 per minute. He stared at the number, and for the first time ever, he was truly afraid. Not of the mountain, of the silence. Tessa wasn't there, and the island had changed. It wasn't hot, it was empty. Caden sat on a black rock in the middle of 40 leagues of black rock, with a column of smoke rising above him and no one around. He thought that if she didn't come back, he'd die with 8 million accumulation units. The richest dead man on the continent. He laughed out loud. The laughter sounded hollow. He stopped. He spent the first day looking for food. He knew there was no food. He checked anyway. He walked 4 leagues along the shore in both directions and peered into the water. The water was murky, and nothing moved in it. He found gray-green spots on the rocks, scraped them off with a knife, and tasted them. It wasn't food. He spat it out. He found dry grass as thin as a hair in a crevice, and it crumbled in his hands. He returned empty-handed. By evening, he sat down by the canal and began drinking the water, and he drank it until his stomach ached. He knew it wasn't helping. He knew the water was a deception. But that deception gave him one more day. He spent the second day thinking. He sat on the ridge and looked at the line, construction according to blueprint, and the price of 20,000. He'd earned that much in an hour and a half. He opened the line, and inside it was empty. Not gray, empty. The system was waiting for a blueprint. Caden didn't know what a blueprint was. He tried to imagine a house. Nothing happened. He tried to imagine the house in more detail. Nothing. He tried to draw a house with a knife on a rock. Nothing. He sat there getting angry, and then he realized. The casting machine worked from a model. It needed an object, a real one, something you could touch. That meant the construction process needed an object too, only an object the size of a house, which meant he needed a model. Caden sat there until dark and carved a curved box with a hole for a door out of a piece of wood from a crate using his knife. He placed it on the stone and paid 20,000. The ground trembled. A ripple spread through the air. and before him stood a black box 4 times a man's height, with a hole in place of a door. Caden looked at it and realized he had just built the first house on an island where no one lived. He stepped inside. Inside, it was dark and quiet, and for the first time in 11 days, there was no wind. He lay down on the floor, and the floor was warm. He fell asleep instantly. He slept for 11 hours, and it was the first normal sleep of his life. He spent the 3rd day in fear. He woke up and realized he couldn't get up right away. Hunger had ceased to be a pain and had become a weakness. He sat down against the wall of his box and looked at the counter. It had risen to 300,000 overnight. Caden stared at that number and realized it was useless. He could build a tower. He could cast 100 boats. He could create white heat anywhere on the island. He couldn't make a single loaf of bread. He sat there thinking about it for a long time, and then he realized something very important. His power didn't create. His power only transferred. It took heat from here and placed it there. It took the form of a tree and placed it into metal. It didn't make anything out of nothing. So he would never be able to make bread. So bread would have to be brought in. So he needed people. Always. Forever. Caden sat and looked at the cold band on his wrist and realized that the greatest power he had received made him completely dependent on other people. It was almost laughable. By evening on the 3rd day, he went ashore and sat down to look out at the strait. He sat there until dark. There was no boat. He returned to his box, lay down, and thought that Tessa wouldn't come. He didn't blame her. He wouldn't have come either. He lay there and counted how many units he would accumulate before he died, and it came to about 2 million. On the morning of the 4th day, he didn't go to the shore. He went to the lava flow. He decided that if he was going to die, he'd do it with the counter at full capacity. He sat 500 paces from the flowing tongue of the river, and the skin on his face tightened, and the numbers blurred into a solid smudge, and he wasn't counting aloud, and time vanished. A sound brought him back. It wasn't the sound of the mountain. The mountain hummed steadily, and he'd grown used to it. This was a different sound. High-pitched. Rhythmic. Caden turned his head and didn't immediately realize he was looking at a man striking a rock with a piece of metal. The man wasn't Tessa. There were 9 of them. They stood 300 paces away and were looking at him. They wore leather aprons. 3 of them had hammers resting on their shoulders. Caden stood up and realized he couldn't feel his legs. He walked toward them and collapsed after 20 paces. They helped him up. It smelled of stranger's sweat, and it was the best thing he'd smelled in 11 days. Someone poured water into his mouth, and then someone shoved a piece of bread crust into his hands, and he ate it. It was stale, and it was the best thing he'd eaten in 2 lifetimes. Tessa crouched down beside him. She said she was a day late. She said she couldn't have made it any faster. She said everything had gone wrong there. Caden chewed and listened. Tessa told him everything briefly. She said she'd gone to her father's workshop and shown the stone to the foreman. She said the foreman had kicked her out. She said she'd come back at night and place the stone in the cold furnace where the young apprentice was sitting. She said that an hour later, the furnace was still hot without any coal, and the boy was screaming so loud the whole street could hear him. She said that by morning, 40 people were standing by the pit. She said the foreman wanted to take the stone, and she said there was only 1 stone and that she would break it. She said that was when they started talking to her. She said the workshop gave her 3 sacks of barley, 2 sacks of dried fish, a barrel of oil, and 9 men in exchange for a single stone. She said she'd asked for more, and they hadn't given it to her. Caden listened, doing the math in his head. 1 stone was worth 500 units. He earned 500 units in 2.5 minutes, sitting at the workbench. He looked at the 9 people in aprons and the sacks behind their backs and realized that he had just bought his life for 2.5 minutes of his time. He asked Tessa what she had told them. She said she had told the truth. She said there was an unending heat on the island. She said that whoever went there would work without coal. She said she had promised them either money or land. Caden looked at the 9 of them. He asked who they were. A man in his 50s, with a sun-scorched face and an arm that wouldn't straighten, stepped forward. He said his name was Merton Gold. He said he had been the foreman of the second pit for 22 years. He said that 3 years ago, the mine had raised the price of coal and his pit had been shut down. He said that since then, he had been doing underground in a village 6 leagues from the city. He said he'd been told there was heat here. He said that if it were true, he would stay. He said that if it were not true, he would leave on foot, walking along the riverbed. Caden looked at him. He looked at his right hand, which would not straighten. He looked at the other 8. He saw the same thing. Burns, old ones, professional ones. These weren't adventurers. These were people who'd been cast out. He thought that the great houses had taken lands with 18,000 farms, and there were healthy, strong plowmen there. But they'd brought him 9 cripples from sealed pits, and he thought he didn't need a plowman. He wasn't going to plow. Caden struggled to his feet. He was weak and unsteady. He looked at Merton and said he felt the heat. Merton asked where. Caden pointed toward the lava. Merton looked at the flowing tongue of lava behind Caden. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said he could see the lava. He said you couldn't work with lava. He said that lava was like the sea to someone who was thirsty. He said there was too much of it, and it wasn't in the right form. Caden nodded and said the master was right. He crouched down and placed his palm on a rock. His counter read 400,000. He spent 500. A small black pebble settled in his palm. He held it out to Merton. Merton took it and didn't drop it. He held it in his mangled hand. He raised it to his face. He closed his eyes. He stood like that for a minute. Then he opened his eyes, and Caden saw that the master of the second pit was crying. Merton said one sentence. He said that the heat was even. Caden didn't understand. Tessa explained later. She said that the heat of cold dances. She said that the master spends his whole life fighting not the cold, but this dance. She said that steady heat is what they speak of in the pit as paradise. Merton tucked the stone into his bosom, turned to the 8 others, and said that they were staying. He didn't ask them. He simply stated it. Caden watched this and realized that he had just bought 9 people. Not with money, not with land, and not with an oath. He had bought them with steady heat. He led them to his box. They walked in silence. They looked at the canal where water flowed. They looked at the black, seamless walls of the house. They asked no questions. Merton stopped at the wall and tapped on it. He listened to the sound. He said that metal like this doesn't exist. Caden said he knew. By evening, they had laid out their bags, and Tessa cooked the barley in a bowl that Caden had carved directly out of the rock. 9 people ate in silence and stared at the fire that wasn't there. There was no fire. There was just a bowl of water on a hot rock, and that was all. Merton said that in 22 years, this was the first time he'd eaten a meal not by a campfire. That night, Caden sat alone on the ridge and looked at the counter. 400,000. He thought about what Merton had said. Lava is a sea for those who want to drink. Merton was right, and he didn't know just how right he was. Caden couldn't sell lava. He couldn't sell heat. He could only sell pebbles. And he'd have to make a lot of pebbles, haul them around and sell them. And that was trade, not power. And then he remembered the number he'd heard in the square 14 days ago. The Tarn Valley. 18,000 households. Merton asked again what it meant to make it through the winter. Caden said he'd explain it once and then they'd get to work. He sat down on a rock and began counting aloud. He said that every household had a stove. He said that every stove burned coal or wood. He said that coal costs 3 silver coins per winter. He said there are about 1 million households in the kingdom. He said that's 3 million silver coins every year just to keep people from freezing. He said that money goes to the coal miners, the lumberjacks, and the carters. He said that from now on, it would go here instead. Merton listened, his face as still as stone. Then he said that the boy didn't understand. He said that coal was hauled from 60 leagues away and was still cheaper than hauling it from 100. He said that it took 6 hours to reach the mainland across the strait and a month's journey to the distant lands. He said that no one would haul a stone for a month just for 3 silver coins. Caden listened. He said the master was right. He said that was why, at first, they would heat not 1,000,000 courtyards, but just one port across the way. Merton paused and said that was a conversation worth having. The first week, they did nothing but make pebbles. Caden sat on the ridge and laid them out in a row, one after another. 500 units each. He made 200 a minute, which meant each pebble took him 2.5 minutes. He made 200 a day. He could have made more, but the node hit a limit. Caden checked and found the line. Limit 200 concurrent carriers. He cursed. The system wouldn't let him stockpile them indefinitely. 200 stones, and that was it. After that, he either had to spend them or wait. He told Tessa about it. She said that was actually a good thing. She said that if he could make 10,000 stones in a week, he'd crash the price of coal in a month, and they'd kill him in a month and a half. Caden looked at her and realized she was smarter than him when it came to the part of life where people actually live. He asked how many she thought they could sell. She said no more than 20 a month, and only to one workshop. She said that then it would be a rarity, not a commodity. She said that people pay 10 times as much for a rarity. Caden said that in that case, they wouldn't be making a rarity. He said that a rarity is a trap. He said that a rarity is when people buy from you and then come and take the source. He said that protection isn't just a small quantity. Protection is when they can't do without you. Tessa didn't understand. Merton understood. He said that the boy wants the city to get used to it. Caden nodded. He said that a person who buys a rare item can lose it and move on with their life. He said that a person whose home stops being heated dies. He said they need to make people dependent on them completely, quickly, and that they shouldn't get used to life without them again. Merton was silent for a long time and then said that it was despicable. Caden agreed. He said it was despicable. He said he had no other way because he had neither soldiers, nor walls, nor a name. He said the only thing he had going for him was that people were cold. 9 foundry workers had built themselves homes this past week. Caden cut the stone while they hauled and laid it. He offered to cast their entire houses for them, just like his box. Merton refused. He said a person must build their own home with their own hands. Otherwise, it's not a home, but a box. Caden didn't argue. He watched as 9 cripples with burned hands laid a wall of slabs he had cut, and he realized that Merton was right again about something important that he himself couldn't sense. Meanwhile, Tessa set to work on the water. She ran 3 branches off the main canal and built 3 basins at different heights. In the top one, the water was nearly boiling. In the bottom one, it cooled overnight. She said that now they always had hot water. She said that in the city, hot water meant a bathhouse, and a bathhouse meant money. Caden noted this in his mind and said nothing. On the 8th day, Tessa set out across the strait with 20 pebbles. Caden gave her 2 foundry workers. He said she would never go alone again. He said that was the island's 3rd rule. She left in a black boat and returned 4 days later. The boat was sitting so low in the water that Caden was frightened. She brought back 8 sacks of barley, 4 barrels of salted meat, 2 small barrels of oil, salt, nails, 3 saws, axes, cloth, and 42 silver coins. Caden counted everything and sat down. 20 pebbles equal 10,000 units. He earned 10,000 units in 50 minutes. In less than an hour, his time had turned into 2 months' worth of food for 12 people, plus tools, plus money. He sat there looking at the sacks and, for the first time, truly understood what had happened in the square 14 days ago. They hadn't foisted junk on him. He'd brought out the only soil that works faster than a man. Tessa sat down next to him and said there was bad news. Caden said he knew. She was surprised. He said it was the price. She nodded. She said the foreman had paid 2 silver coins per stone instead of the 3 he'd promised. She said he'd explained it by saying that stones weren't rare anymore. Caden laughed. He said the foreman was smart. He said the foreman had figured out the same thing he had and decided to make the first move. Tessa asked what they should do. Caden said nothing. He said that next time they'd bring 40 stones and the foreman would pay 1 silver coin per stone. He said that after that, it would be half a coin. He said that was right and that's how it should be. Tessa said that then they'd go bankrupt. Caden said no. He said the workshop would go bankrupt. He explained. He said the workshop depends on coal. He said the workshop bought the stones from them to avoid paying the coal miners. He said that now the coal miners would bring less coal to the port because the workshop was buying less. He said that in 6 months, the coal miners would move to another port. He said that in a year, there wouldn't be any coal at all in this port. He said that then the price of a stone wouldn't be 2 silver coins. It would be whatever they wanted. Merton listened to this while standing nearby and then sat down on a stone. He said the boy was scary. Caden asked why. Merton said he'd seen the workshop torn down by force. He said he'd seen the workshop torn down by money. He said he hadn't seen the workshop torn down by care. Caden didn't answer. He was thinking about something else. He was thinking that in 4 days, he hadn't once come within 3 leagues of the forge, and that his counter had stayed around 200 per minute the whole time. He thought that wasn't enough. He opened the form node and looked at the construction according to blueprint line, 20,000. He looked at the line below it, which was grayed out. He couldn't read it. All he saw was the price, 200,000. Caden sat there staring at that grayed out line. 200,000 was 17 hours on the ridge. That morning, Merton worked in silence, and Caden realized that the master had been thinking all night, just as he had. Merton was carving a model out of a plank. It was ugly. It looked like a coffin turned upside down with a slit at eye level. He said it wasn't armor. He said armor was for someone who fights. He said it was a wall. He said the boy would hide behind the wall and stick his arm out. Caden asked why the slit. Merton said that a person who can't see where they're going would burn faster than one who can. Caden placed the model on a rock and paid 2,000. The ground trembled. A black wall as tall as a man stood before him, with a slit and 2 brackets on the inside. Merton tapped it, listened to the sound, and said it was time to test it. They tested it for 3 days. They hauled the wall to the lava in pieces and set it up. Caden would step behind it and walk forward while Tessa counted aloud. The first time, he made it to 300 steps and turned back. The second time, he made it to 200, and the wall got so hot that the brackets burned his palms. Merton redesigned the model, and Caden cast a second one with a double wall, and Tessa poured water from the canal into the gap. The third time, he made it to 100 steps. His counter was so far off at 100 steps that the numbers were unreadable. He stood there for exactly the time Tessa counted to 40, then came out. He came out, sat down on a rock, and looked at the counter. 320,000 in 40 counts. Merton asked what was there. Caden said that was all there was. On the 4th day, Caden went to the lava with a full counter and opened the gray line, and it stopped being gray. It was called Channel. The price was 200,000. The description was 1 line long, and Caden read it 5 times. Change in the flow path. He couldn't believe it. He stepped out from behind the wall and looked at the tongue of lava that had been creeping down the slope in the same direction for 100 years. He looked at it as if it were a river. and he realized that all this time he'd been thinking too small. He gathered heat in his palm. He made pebbles 500 at a time. He carved a channel for a mug of water an hour, and before him flowed a river of fire 20 paces wide, and it flowed wherever it wanted, and he had never once thought that it could be turned. He called for Merton and Tessa and all 9 of them. He led them to a ridge from which the slope was visible. He pointed down. He said that the lava flows south and falls into the sea, and that this has been happening every day for 100 years. He said that this is the very sea for anyone who wants to drink. He said he was going to dig a well. Merton asked what that meant. Caden said it meant this. He said they wouldn't go to the lava. He said the lava would come to them. The foundry workers were silent. Then one of them said that was madness. He said the lava would burn everything. Caden said yes. He said that was why it wouldn't come this way. He pointed to a bare, black slope 2 leagues east of the camp. He said there was nothing there. He said there would be a pit there. He said the lava would fall into the pit and pool there, and they would sit around the pit and draw warmth from it. Merton sat down on a rock. He sat there for a long time. Then he raised his head, and Caden saw on his face the same expression he'd seen when the master held the first pebble. Merton said that his whole life he'd been carrying coal to the iron. He said that the boy was suggesting they place the iron by a fire that never goes out. He said that the foundry would give up the whole town for a pit like that. He said that no one on the continent had a pit like that. He said that a pit like that couldn't exist. They dug for 6 days. Caden did the cutting. He cut for 8 hours straight, and Tessa counted aloud and relieved him every hour so he wouldn't lose track of time. The foundrymen shoveled out the cooled slag and piled it into a mound. The pit turned out round, 30 paces across, 5 deep. Merton walked along the edge and made them redo it 3 times. He said a round pit wouldn't work. He said it needed a slope toward the bottom and a drain, and that the slurry had to flow, not stand still. Otherwise, a crust would form on top and everything would cool down. Caden did as he was told. He caught himself realizing that he'd stopped arguing with Merton altogether. He understood why. Merton had held the heat with his hands for 22 years. Caden had held it for 4 weeks. And even then, with someone else's power. On the 7th day, they cut a passage from the lava flow to the pit. The passage was 2 leagues long, and Caden led the way from top to bottom at the slope Tessa had chosen. He was cutting the last 200 paces behind the wall, and Tessa was counting, her voice trembling. He left the final isthmus 3 paces thick. He stepped out, and all 12 of them moved back to the ridge, where they stood and looked down. Caden sat on a rock and typed. He typed 200,000 in 20 minutes. He opened the channel line, looked at the isthmus 2 leagues away, and said, "Yes." There was no sound. The isthmus simply vanished. And the river of fire, which had been flowing south for 100 years, paused for a second and turned east. It flowed through the channel. It moved slowly. It moved like honey. It reached the pit in 3 hours and began to fall into it, continuing to fall all night. 12 people stood on the crest and watched as their pit filled with light. By morning, it was full. It stood there, breathing. A gray crust moved across the surface, cracking, and beneath it was white. The air above it trembled so much that the ridge on the other side rippled. Merton stood and watched, unable to say a word. Caden looked at the meter. He was sitting on the ridge, 200 paces from the pit. The meter ticked just like the lava itself. 8,000 per minute, 500,000 per hour, 12 million per day. He sat there counting, and the numbers ceased to make sense. He remembered the Tarn Valley and its 18,000 farms in 40 years without a single crop failure, and realized that the entire valley, over all 40 years, had not yielded its owner as much as his pit had in a week. He sat there, staring at the white spot below, and thought that the entire difference between him and the heir to the house of Askell lay in one thing. Askell had taken the land that feeds. He had taken the land that burns, and it turned out that the burning was faster. Tessa sat down beside him and asked what to do now. Caden said that now they had heat. He said that now they had to do everything else. He began to list them, counting on his fingers, and stopped at the fourth. He needed ore. It was right under his feet. He needed water. It was flowing in the canal. He needed heat. He stood in the pit. He needed people. There were 12 of them. He looked at his 12 men and realized what his real shortage was. Not heat. Hands. He could cast 1,000 hammers. He couldn't cast the one who would swing them. Merton walked over and said they needed to set up the pit properly. He said they needed molds and anvils and bellows, and that the bellows weren't necessary because they had heat, and that this was driving him crazy. He said he'd spent 22 years learning how to stoke the fire, and now there was no need to blow. He said half his skills had turned to rubbish overnight. He said this without anger. He said it in surprise. Caden asked what was left. Merton said what remained was knowing how long to hold it. He said that was all there was to it. They did their first smelting 2 days later. Caden chopped up the black stone, and they dumped it into a chute that ran from the edge of the pit. Merton stood behind the wall, peering through the slit and calling out when to pour. The stone flowed. It oozed out. At first, the flow was murky, and then Merton said, "Here it is," and they directed the stream into the mold. The metal cooled overnight. Merton broke open the mold, pulled out the ingot, weighed it in his hand, and then sat right down on the ground. He said it was iron. He said it was pure iron. He said he'd held iron like this in his hands twice in his life, and both times it had been imported and cost as much as a house. Caden asked why. Merton explained. He said that iron in the pit is always impure because coal gets mixed in with it. He said that coal gives off heat, and that same coal corrupts the metal, and that a craftsman's entire job is a battle against his own fuel. He said there was no fuel here. He said there was only heat here. He picked up the ingot and said that the boy had removed the coal from the iron. Caden stood there, looking at the piece of gray metal in the cripple's hands, and realized that what wasn't iron in his hands. He was holding profit. That same evening, he sat down with Tessa and they did the math. Caden sat by the pit until morning, staring at the 3 words. A live specimen is required. He didn't understand them, and yet he did at the same time. Casting required an object. Construction required a model. So this required someone. He looked at his hands. He thought of Tessa. He thought of Merton. He stood up and walked back to camp, and on the way, he realized one thing, and it made him feel sick. The system never created anything. It only transferred, shaping wood into metal, heat from here to there. So a living specimen wasn't about bringing someone back to life. It was about taking something away from the living. He didn't open the code. He returned to camp, went to bed, and couldn't sleep. In the morning, work began, and it wasn't that he'd forgotten about the code. He'd put it aside. The work was simple, and there was too much of it. 12 people couldn't handle the pit. Merton counted aloud, and the numbers didn't add up. For one smelting run, they needed to haul in ore. The ore had to be cut. Only Caden could do the cutting. So Caden cut ore from morning till night, and did nothing else. Then, the ore had to be hauled to the chute, which was done by 6 men using wheelbarrows that Caden had cast based on a model. Then, it had to be poured. Then poured into molds. Then removed. Then cooled. Then stacked. 12 men produced 4 ingots a day instead of 40. Merton said the pit was idle for 9 out of every 12 hours and that it was a crime. He said every hour of downtime was money down the drain. Caden listened and caught himself realizing that, for the first time in his life, His problem wasn't a shortage, but an excess. He had more heat than he could use. He had more ore than he could lift. He didn't have enough people. He went to the port by himself. He took Tessa and Merton and 2 smelters, and they crossed the strait in a black boat loaded with 40 stones. Tessa kept saying the whole way that it was a bad idea. She said they knew his face there. She said he was the heir from the burning island and that the whole court had laughed at him. Caden said that was the plan. The port was called Olshaven. It was a city of 20,000. It stood on a cliff and smelled of fish and coal, and Caden realized only now what coal smelled like. Coal smells like a sick person. They entered the workshop, and the foreman came out to meet them himself. He was fat and cheerful, and he looked at Caden as if he were a bad joke. He said he was glad to see the young heir in person. He said he'd heard the island was a fun place. He said he'd pay 1.5 silver coins per stone. Caden said he wasn't selling. The foreman stopped smiling. Caden placed the ingot on the table. Merton looked away. The foreman picked up the ingot and turned it over in his hands, then called someone over. A second man came in, and the 2 of them examined the ingot for about 5 minutes, during which time Caden didn't say a word. Then the foreman asked how much. Caden said he wouldn't sell this one either. The foreman sat down. He asked what the young master wanted. Caden said he wanted people. He said he'd take anyone. He said he'd take those who'd been cast out. He said he'd take them with or without hands. He said he'd pay with food, shelter, and silver, and that there would be little silver, but plenty of food. The foreman laughed and said no one would go to the burning island. Caden said 9 had already gone. He said all 9 were alive. He said all 9 were working in the heat that never dies down. The foreman stopped laughing for the second time during the conversation, and Caden saw on his face what he'd been looking for. Not greed, fear. The foreman understood. He realized that if the boy on the island had a constant heat source, then in a year's time, the Olshaven workshop would be of no use to anyone. He didn't say that. He said he'd think about it. Caden left the workshop and headed not for the port, but for the lower city. Tessa asked where he was going. He said to the place where those who had nothing to lose lived. They found the place within an hour. It was a street right by the water where there were flop houses for seasonal workers. There were people sitting there who came to the port for unloading and left when there was no cargo. There were about 300 of them. Caden climbed onto a barrel. Tessa grabbed his sleeve and said they'd kill him right then and there. He said no. He said he had something for which they wouldn't kill him. He didn't speak for long. He didn't mention the island. He didn't mention the heat. He said he was hiring people. He said he'd feed them barley and fish twice a day. He said he'd provide a home. He said he'd pay 1 silver coin a month. He said the work was hard and hot. He said anyone who wanted to could come forward. No one came forward. Then he said one last thing. He said that where they would be working, there was no winter. The crowd stirred. Someone asked where that was. Caden said it was on Caldera, and then they began to disperse. Caden stood on a barrel and watched as 300 people walked away, realizing he had lost. He climbed down from the barrel. And just then, one man approached. He was about 40 years old. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. He asked if it was true that there was no winter there. Caden said it was true. He said the ground was always warm and that they had hot water in the canal all year round. The man asked what it was that killed people there. Caden could have lied. He looked at him and told the truth. He said that the air in the lowlands was deadly there, and that's why they had a rule not to sleep below the ridge, and that no one had died in his group in the past month. The man thought for a moment and said that 2 of his children had died that winter. He said it wasn't from hunger. He said it was from the cold. He said he'd go. 4 more men joined him. Then 7 more. By evening, Caden had 23 people with him. Tessa stood there, pale as a sheet. She said she didn't understand. She said he'd offered them silver and food, and they'd been leaving, But then he'd mentioned winter, and they'd stayed. Caden said she'd simply never been frozen to death before. He said that could be found. He said that silver could be stolen. He said that warmth couldn't be. He said that warmth was the only thing a person couldn't obtain for themselves. He said that for that, they would follow him even into the mouth of a volcano. Merton listened to this as he stood nearby, and then said very quietly that now he understood what the boy had meant when he said they would make winter. They returned in 2 trips. 23 people. That was 3 times the entire population of the island. Caden watched them from the boat. They weren't workers. They were the port's trash. Half of them were missing something. He remembered the square and the 198 signs and thought that history was repeating itself. The heirs take the best. He's left with what's been discarded, and it turns out that what's been discarded burns better. On the island, he put them all to work mining ore. Merton divided them into shifts. After a week, the pit was yielding 20 ingots a day. After 2 weeks, 30. Caden mined for 10 hours at a time and got so exhausted he couldn't speak. Tessa fed him by hand, and he fell asleep sitting up. He worked the ore and realized he had become the bottleneck of his own island. Everything depended on him. Only he could work the ore. Only he could build. Only he could make the stones. 23 people hauled ore for a single boy who sat on a rock and guided them with his hand. And then that evening he sat down, opened the form node, and looked at the 6th line. A live specimen is required. 2 million. He raised 2 million in 4 hours. He sat alone by the pit, staring at the line, and realized there were 2 paths forward. He could transport people in sacks from Olshaven, feed them, and build them houses, and in a year he'd have 500 people and a never-ending headache. Or he could pull the trigger. Caden sat there for an hour. Then he called for Merton. He told him everything honestly. He said there was a line. He said it was worth 2 million. He said it required a live specimen, that he didn't know what that meant, and that he was afraid to find out. Merton listened in silence. Then he asked one thing. He asked if the specimen would be lost. Caden said he didn't know. Merton thought for a moment and said that in that case, he should be the specimen. Caden said no. Merton looked at him with his stiff arm resting on his knee and said the boy didn't understand. He said he was 53 years old, that his arm didn't work, that his eyesight was failing, and that he had about 5 years of work left in him. Caden stared at the line and didn't press it. He sat there until dawn. Merton fell asleep right there on the rock beside him, and Caden covered him with his cloak and sat there thinking. An autonomous form with the master's skill embedded. He parsed every word. A form is what they cast. A skill is what they took from Merton. Autonomous means self-sufficient. He sat there and realized that if he pressed the button, he would get an iron object that could do the same thing as the master who had held the heat in his hands for 22 years. He wasn't afraid that it wouldn't work. He was afraid that it would work. In the morning, Merton woke up, and the first thing he did was go to the trough, look at the solidified ingot, and say that yesterday's melt had been overheated by 40 counts. He said this without looking. He said it based on the color of the fracture. Caden asked if he still knew how to do it. Merton looked at him as if he were a fool and said it wasn't the sort of thing one could forget. Caden exhaled for the 2nd time that day. He pressed the button at noon in front of everyone. He placed 50,000 on the stone, opened the channel, and the earth trembled and the air rippled. Before him stood something he couldn't name right away. It was 1.5 times the height of a human. It was black. It had no face. It had 4 arms and 2 legs and a barrel-like torso. It stood there, motionless. 23 people were silent. Then it moved. It walked toward the trough. It didn't walk like a human. It walked steadily, without swaying. It approached the trough, stopped, and lowered its lower pair of arms into the cooling slurry, and Tessa screamed. It pulled its hands back. They were dripping, but they were unharmed. It stood there for a second. Then it picked up the shovel lying nearby and began shoveling slag from the edge of the trough. It did this steadily. It did this in silence. It didn't stop. Merton walked over to it, stood beside it, and watched for a minute. Then he said it was shoveling correctly. He said it was shoveling just as he himself would have. He said that it was even working with the left side first, and that he always started on the left because his right arm wouldn't bend. He fell silent. Then he said that it was him. Caden didn't know what to say. He looked at the black, headless thing shoveling slag and at the 53-year-old cripple standing next to it and realized that he had just done the most terrible thing he'd ever done. He hadn't stolen Merton's arm. He'd stolen his irreplaceability. He'd turned 22 years of someone else's life into a commodity. 50,000 apiece. Merton stood there a little longer, then turned and walked back to camp, not saying a word all day. That evening, Caden went to see him. Merton was sitting by the wall of his house, which he had built with his own hands. Caden sat down beside him and remained silent. Then Merton said he wasn't angry. He said he'd been thinking all day and had come to this realization. He said he'd spent 22 years training apprentices. He said that out of 40 apprentices, 3 had become masters. He said the remaining 37 had gone to make horseshoes and died making horseshoes. He said that every time he'd lost what he'd invested, he said that now it wouldn't be lost. He said that a piece of iron wouldn't get drunk, run away, or forget. He said that this was the first time in his life that he'd taught someone for good. Caden listened and realized that Merton wasn't comforting himself. Merton was comforting him. A month later, 18 foundrymen were working at the pit, not people. Caden made them one by one every hour. 50,000 took 6 minutes of his time at the pit. He sat there and stamped them out like coins, and they materialized out of thin air, walked toward the chute and took their places where Merton directed them. They didn't eat, they didn't sleep. They weren't afraid of the heat. They worked 24 hours a day. The pit stopped standing still altogether. It was producing 120 ingots a day. Then, 200. 23 men from Olshaven stopped hauling ore. Caden pulled them away from that and put them to work on what the iron men couldn't do. They built. They hauled. They kept track of things.
They cooked meals. Tessa organized all this in a week, and Caden realized she was doing what he couldn't. She looked at people. He looked at numbers.
By the end of the second month, the island had changed so much that Caden himself didn't recognize it when he returned from the shore. 6 seamless black workshops stood around the pit. Gutters ran from the pit. The iron ones walked along the gutters. 20 houses stood along the hot water canal. People lived in the houses, and the houses were always warm without a fire. Tessa set up 2 bathhouses, and Caden laughed when he found out how much she charged sailors who began stopping in their cove for a wash. She charged half a silver coin, and the line started forming first thing in the morning. Caden asked why she did this, given their already high turnover. She said it wasn't about the money. She said that every sailor who bathed in hot water on the burning island would spread the word in 4 ports. She said it was cheaper than a messenger. Caden looked at her and realized she was right, and that he wouldn't have thought of it himself. The problem came from exactly where he'd been expecting it. At the end of the second month, 3 ships entered the bay, and they weren't merchants. Tessa ran up to him on the ridge and said they were flying the Crown's banner. Caden went down to the shore. A man in gray stepped off the first ship, a piece of paper in his hand, and Caden recognized him. It was the very same administrator from the square. He was just as stern as ever. He looked out at the bay, the black workshops, the smoke, and the people. Yet his expression didn't change one iota. He unfolded the paper and announced that an unscheduled inspection of the property was being conducted. Caden pointed out that the next scheduled inspection wasn't due for another 8 months. The administrator replied that the Crown had the right to do so. Caden asked on what grounds. The administrator said on the basis of a complaint. Caden asked whose. The administrator looked him straight in the eye for the first time and said it was from the Olshaven workshops. Caden laughed. He couldn't help himself. He laughed and the administrator waited. Then Caden asked what the complaint was about. The overseer read from the paper. He read that the owner of Calder Island was selling an unknown material of unclear origin without the workshop's hallmark. He read that the owner was poaching workers from the port. He read that the owner had altered the flow of the natural fire, thereby creating a threat to the strait. Caden listened to the last point and realized that the workshop foreman was smarter than he'd thought. The first 2 points were nonsense. Caden stood on the ridge watching the foreman's back and didn't call out to him. He realized there was no need. The old man had said exactly as much as he could get away with. 3 ships had sailed by evening. Caden gathered everyone in the square in front of the workshops. There were 35 of them, and 18 iron men stood behind them in the darkness, motionless. He told them everything as it was. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said that in 6 months, the island might be taken away. He said that then everything they had built would remain here, and they would be gone. He said he didn't know what to do. He said it out loud and saw 23 people from Olshaven exchange glances. Tessa later told him that was a mistake. She said a lord doesn't tell people he doesn't know. Caden said he wasn't any kind of lord. He said that if he lied to them now, they wouldn't believe him later when it really mattered. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the pit and stared into the white. He thought about what the steward had said at the end. The complaint hadn't come from the workshop. That meant the workshop was a front. That meant someone had noticed them before the workshop did. Someone with enough clout to sway the crown. He ran through everyone he knew in his head and realized he didn't know anyone. He had no court. He had no connections. For 14 months, he'd looked only at the ground and the counter. And then he realized his second mistake, and it was bigger than the first. He'd built his island as if the world ended beyond the strait. He hadn't built a single relationship with anyone on the outside. In the morning, he called Tessa and Merton and told them he was going to the capital. Tessa said it was suicide. She said no one was waiting for him there except those who'd filed a complaint. Caden said he knew. He said that was why he was going. He said 6 months wasn't long enough to come up with a counter-argument. He said it was long enough to make himself indispensable. Merton asked to whom. Caden said to the one who signs the documents. He left 2 days later, taking Tessa and 4 boxes with him. The first contained pebbles. The second contained ingots. The third contained the cloth in which was wrapped what he'd been making for the past 2 nights. The fourth contained food. They sailed to Olshaven for 6 hours and then traveled overland for 11 days. During those 11 days, Caden saw the kingdom for the first time. He didn't look at it as an heir. He looked at it as a counter. He saw villages, and in every village there was a stove. And in every stove wood was burning. He saw a forest being cut down and hauled 40 leagues away. He saw people gathering kindling at the end of summer because they feared winter. He traveled through a foreign, rich land and counted how much warmth that land lacked. By the end of the journey, he realized a simple thing, and it turned his whole world upside down. He thought he was selling heat. He wasn't selling heat, he was selling time. A man who gathers kindling spends a day doing so. A man who heats his home with firewood gets up at night to stoke the fire. A woman who cooks over a fire sits by the fire. The entire kingdom was occupied with one thing all year round. It was keeping warm. Caden sat in the wagon and looked at yet another village, realizing that if he gave these people an eternally warm stone, he wouldn't make them richer. He would give them a day. To everyone, every day. And then he thought of a number. 1 million households. 1 day per day. The capital was called Vern. It was larger than Caden could have imagined. He looked at the walls and realized that his entire pit could fit inside a single tower. They rented a room in the lower city, and Tessa went to investigate while Caden sat for 4 days and waited. She returned on the 5th day, sat down, and said she'd found out who had filed the complaint. She said it was the house of Askell. Caden remembered the tall guy with the straight back who'd taken the Tarn Valley first and hadn't looked at the signs. He asked what he wanted the island for. Tessa said it wasn't about the island. She said it was about the strait. She said that the house of Askell owned all the crossings on the southern shore and that all trade from the south passed through them, and they collected tolls. She said that Caden's black ships sailed through the strait past their posts and paid nothing because on paper it was transportation within their own territory. Caden laughed. He said they'd raised the crown because of the toll. Tessa said no. She said he had to hear her out. She said that 3 months ago, Askell had bought up all the coal mines on the eastern slope. She said he'd gotten them cheap. She said he'd bought them because coal prices had been rising every year for 20 years in a row. Caden stopped laughing. He understood. Askell had put everything into coal, and then stones that provide heat without coal came across the strait. Tessa said that if Caden had been trading in iron, no one would have batted an eye. She said that iron is just iron. She said that he was trading in heat, and heat was what Askell's entire empire was built on. Caden sat in silence for a long time. Then he said that he now understood 2 things. First, that they would never leave him alone. Second, that he was on the right path. He said that if the man who had taken the best land in the kingdom went to war a year later with a boy from the Burning Rock, then the rock was better. He went to see the king 6 days later. Not right away. First, he did what he'd thought of while in the wagon. He rented an empty warehouse by the water for 8 silver coins. He bought 4 old stoves. He filled them with pebbles. He called over his neighbors. Just the neighbors. Laundresses, porters, and widows. He told them the stove would burn for free for a week, and that if they liked it, he'd be back. He didn't take any money. Tessa said he'd gone mad. 4 days later, there was a line of 200 people outside the warehouse. 6 days later, there were 400, and the city guard dispersed them twice. On the 7th day, a man sent by the district chief came to Caden and offered him 20 silver pieces to leave the district. Caden said he'd leave for free if the man told him one thing. He asked who was in charge of the furnaces in the city. The man said there was no such person. He said there was a city stockpile overseer, and that in winter he was more important than the mayor. Caden found the overseer on the 8th day. He was old and angry, and he didn't want to talk. Caden didn't try to sell anything. He placed a small stone on the table and said one sentence. He said that this winter, no one in Verna would freeze. The overseer looked at the stone. Then he looked at Caden. Then he asked how many there were. Caden said as many as needed. The overseer said 400,000 were needed. Caden sat down. He did the math in his head. 400,000 pebbles at 500 units each. That's 200 million. His pit produced 12 million a day. 17 days of work, but he could only handle 200 at a time. He sat there in silence, and the overseer decided he was intimidated by the number. The overseer said that's exactly what he thought. He said everyone arrives full of wonder and leaves when they hear the volume. He said the city isn't a village. Caden looked up and asked something else. He asked, what if the stone went not into a fist, but into a house? The overseer didn't understand. Caden explained. He said, why put 400,000 stones into 400,000 furnaces? He said you could use a single stone the size of a tower. He said you could use it to send hot water through pipes to every house. He said that's already how it's done on his island, and that 35 people live there without a single fire. The overseer sat there and looked at him for about 2 minutes. Then he stood up, walked over to the window, and stood there with his back to him. The steward's name was Old Hess, And he didn't introduce Kaiden to the king. He introduced him to the man who had stood behind the king for 40 years. His name was Irvin Crane, and he was the keeper of the kingdom's winter supplies. Not a minister, not a lord. Just the man who decided every year how much coal would go where. Hess said that Crane loved no one and took nothing, and that this was the only reason he was still alive. The meeting took place in a small, windowless room. Crane was about 60 years old and had fingernails yellowed by coal dust that he hadn't been able to wash off in 30 years of desk work. He looked at the pebble that Kaiden had placed on the table but didn't pick it up. He said he already knew everything about it. He said he'd read the report from the Olshaven workshop a month ago. He said he'd read the complaint from the Askell household. He said he'd read the administrator's report and that the report was strange. Kaiden asked in what way. Crane said that in 40 years, the foreman had never once written a word in a report that he had written this time. Kaiden asked which one. Crane said the word was impressive. Then he fell silent and looked at Kaiden for a long time, and Kaiden realized he was being thoroughly sized up. Then Crane asked one thing. He asked how old the boy was. Kaiden said 19. Crane said he was 19 when he came to this office as a clerk. He said that back then, 8,000 died that winter. He said that 2,000 were dying now. He said that this was his whole life. 40 years for the sake of 6,000. He said that the boy with his stone was offering him nothing for a single winter, and that was why he wanted to understand what the catch was. Kaiden said that there was a catch and that he would name it himself. He said that if the kingdom sat on his stone, then the kingdom would sit on him personally. He said that he's the only one who makes the stone. He said that if he died, everything would come to a standstill in a month. He said this wasn't power. He said it was a noose around everyone's neck. Crane leaned back in his chair and said that this was the first honest answer he'd heard in that room in 10 years. He asked what the boy suggested they do about it. Kaiden said he suggested passing it on. Crane didn't understand. Kaiden said he had a way to extract a skill from a person and transfer it into iron. He said he'd already done it with the master foundryman. He said the machine now casts better than half the foundry and never sleeps. He said he didn't know if the same could be done to him. He said that if it could, the kingdom would need neither him nor his heirs. He said all it would need was the mountain. Crane sat in silence for a very long time. Then he said the boy was either the stupidest person in the kingdom or the most dangerous. He said that for a proposal like that, anyone in his place would have given up everything. He said he wasn't just anyone. He stood up, walked over to the shelf, took out a folder, and tossed it onto the table. He said it was the report from the 7 northern provinces for the past year. He said the boy could read it while he went to get some paper. Kaiden opened the folder. It contained numbers. He read them for half an hour. The northern provinces, coal consumption, winter mortality rates. He reached a certain line and stopped. Holm province, 9,000 households. No coal had been delivered for 3 years. Winter mortality, 1,400. Reason for non-delivery? The toll for the pass had been raised by the pass owner to a level that made delivery unprofitable. The pass owner, House Askell. Kaiden closed the folder. He sat there staring at the wall. He thought of the tall, straight-backed man who had taken down the first sign and raised it above his head, and the crowd had exhaled. The Tarn Valley. 3 rivers. 18,000 households. 40 years without a crop failure. Kaiden finally realized who his enemy was. Not a greedy lord. Not a competitor. A man who takes the best and then makes things worse for everyone else because he lives off the difference between the best and the worst. Crane returned, and Kaiden asked him directly. He asked why Askell was allowed to do this. Crane said that the pass was his property. He said that the law does not prohibit a man from charging whatever he wants for passage across his own land. He said he'd been writing letters about this for 30 years, and that the letters were being filed away. He said that the House of Askell made up a quarter of the royal council. Caden asked what would happen if they erected a stone in Holm. Crane looked at him. Caden said that then the pass wouldn't be needed. He said there'd be no point in transporting coal. He said the toll would be zero because no one would travel that way. Crane stood there, holding onto the back of a chair. Then he sat down. He said he now understood why Askell had seized the crown over some island. He said the boy wasn't taking trade away from him. He said the boy was eliminating the very need for him. He said it was worse than war. He said you couldn't negotiate with this. He said people were killed for this. He said the boy would be killed before spring. Caden said he knew. He said that was why he'd come here. He said he wasn't asking for protection. He asked for one thing. He asked Crane to grant him the province of Holm for one winter. Not as property, just permission. He said he would cover all the costs there himself. He said that if even one person died, he would pay the crown 10,000 silver coins. He said that if no one died, he asked for only one thing. He asked that it be recorded. Crane asked that it be recorded. Caden asked what should be recorded. He said just the number of deaths. He said that a zero on paper is stronger than any lord. Crane looked at him, and Caden saw the old man trying to count but unable to make out the number. Then Crane said he'd agree. He said he'd sign the agreement and that if the boy had lied, they'd both be hanged. He said he was 61 and that he wasn't afraid. Caden returned to the island 12 days later. He gathered everyone and told them. He said there were 4 months until winter. He said that in 4 months they had to build in Holm what had taken them a year to build here. He said that Holm had 9,000 courtyards and that there was no volcano there. Merton asked how. Caden said he didn't know. And then Tessa stood up and said she knew. She said everyone was looking in the wrong direction. She said that all year long they'd been carrying 500 stones at a time, like water in their palms. She asked why they couldn't make 1,000,000 stones. Caden opened the seal note in front of everyone and looked. Sell, 500. Limit, 200. He said it wasn't possible. Tessa asked if he'd tried. Caden fell silent. He hadn't tried. He'd been doing the same thing for a year because it worked. He sat right there and reached for the sell line and started entering a number not 500, but more. Nothing happened. He entered 1,000. Nothing happened. He sat there for an hour, and Tessa sat beside him. Then he tried something else. He took 2 pebbles, placed them side by side, and tried to merge them. The line flashed. He couldn't believe it. He took 4 pebbles, merged them into one, and ended up with a stone the size of his thumbnail that weighed as much as 4. The counter showed it contained 2,000. He sat there looking at it and realized that the limit wasn't on the amount of heat. The limit was on the number of items. 200 items, and each item could hold as much as it wanted. He'd been carrying water in 200 thimbles for a year because he'd been told 200. By evening, he'd merged all 200 of his pebbles into one. It contained 100,000. It was the size of a fist, and it didn't feel warm to the touch. Merton picked it up, held it, and said that this would be enough for his old pit for 2 winters. Caden looked at the stone in his hand and thought that if he'd been making one mistake all year, how many more were there? A week later, he poured 10 million into a single stone. It was the size of a barrel. They cast it into a mold-like metal, and it came out black and smooth, giving off no heat at all. Tessa walked over, touched it, and said it was cold. Caden said yes. He explained that all the heat was inside, not a drop escaped to the outside. And that was the whole point. He said that this was what they would take to Holm. Merton walked around the barrel and asked what would happen if it cracked. Caden didn't answer. Holm lay in a hollow between 2 ridges, and Caden understood why coal wasn't delivered there as soon as he saw the pass. The road ran in a single lane along a ledge above the abyss. and in the middle of the ledge stood a booth, and inside the booth sat a man named Askell. Caden drove past him in his wagon and paid 4 silver coins for the passage of the empty cart, and the man in the booth didn't even look up. He charged everyone that much. He'd been charging that much for 20 years. Beyond the pass lay the province, and Caden looked at it. For the first 5 minutes, he thought it was abandoned. Houses stood there. People were there. It was just all gray, not from dirt. From smoke. Here they burned peat, and peat produced more smoke than heat, and it had seeped into everything, into the walls, into the faces, into the snow that hadn't fallen yet but was already expected. It was late fall. Tessa walked beside him and said nothing. Then she said that it smelled here just like it did in her neighborhood before her father died. The first thing Caden did was not go to the village elder. He went to look at the stoves. He went into 12 houses in a row without asking permission, and no one chased him away because nobody cared. He examined the stove's construction, measured them with his strides, and felt the walls. By evening, he'd figured out the main thing, and it was bad. The stoves here weren't like the ones in Olshaven. They weren't for heat. They were for smoke. They were built so that the smoke would pass through the house and warm it along the way, because fuel was scarce and people stretched it out as long as possible. If you put a stone in a stove like this, the house would lose its draft, carbon monoxide would fill it, and everyone would die overnight. Caden sat right down in the snow in the yard of the 12th house and realized that 4 months was far too little time. He couldn't put the stones in the stoves. He had to build other stoves, 9,000 of them. He returned to the inn and sat there until morning, doing the math. But the numbers didn't add up. 9,000 stoves meant 9,000 blueprints and installations, 20,000 units each, 180 million. That wasn't even the main issue. The main issue was that he couldn't install a stove inside someone else's house. The line required a blueprint and an empty space. He could build an entire house. He couldn't insert an iron box into a finished house. He tried it that morning on an abandoned shed, but nothing worked out. Tessa said that in that case, they shouldn't build stoves. Caden asked, "Then what?" She said she didn't know, and that he was the smart one, not her. Caden went for a walk around home by himself and walked all day. By evening, he stopped in the middle of the street and stood there so long that people turned to look at him. He looked at the houses. The houses stood close together, wall to wall. The street was narrow. And he remembered his hot water canal on the island, and the 3 basins Tessa had made, and the bathhouses where people lined up starting in the morning. He remembered telling the caretaker, Guess, about the pipes, and how Guess had said it would be 20 years' worth of work. Caden stood on the gray street in home and realized he'd been right back then, though he hadn't realized just how right he was. They shouldn't have installed heating in every house. They should have run it along the street. He went back, woke Tessa up, and started talking, and kept talking for an hour. He said they wouldn't touch the houses at all. He said they'd run a pipe along the street. He said there'd be a branch line from the pipe to each house and just a water box by the wall. He said the smoke would stay just as it was. He said they could burn peat for cooking. He said they wouldn't replace the stove. They'd just add heat right next to it. Tessa sat on the bed and listened, and then said that in that case, people wouldn't have to change anything at all. Caden said that was exactly right. He said that was the whole point. He said people wouldn't give up their stoves for a miracle. He said people would accept the miracle if they didn't have to give anything up. They counted for 3 days. There were 412 streets in Holm. A pipe running down the street was a mass-produced casting and was cheap. A branch line into the house was no big deal. A box by the wall was no big deal. It all came down to one thing: the center. They needed a place from which the hot water would flow. And the water had to stay hot all winter. Caden placed his barrel containing 10 million in the old granary on the square, surrounded it with stones, and ran water around it. The water came to a boil in an hour. He watched the steam and did the math. 10 million divided by 9,000 households for 4 months. He calculated for 2 hours, then set aside a piece of coal and said aloud that it wasn't enough. Tessa asked by how much. Caden said 4 times as much. He said they needed 40 million, but he could bring 10 per trip, and a trip took 11 days one way, leaving 3 months. He said he'd manage to bring 4 barrels if he didn't sleep. He said 4 barrels equaled 40 million. He said it was exactly enough, and that if the winter was harsh, it wouldn't be enough, and people would die. Tessa asked what would happen then. Caden sat there staring at the boiling water and said that then he'd sit in this grain silo all winter. He said he was his own barrel. He said he knew how to save and how to give, and that if he sat here and poured everything he had into the water, it would be enough. Tessa said he wouldn't be able to hoard in home because there's no heat there. Caden said he knew. He said he'd hoard on the island and spend here. He said he'd be shuttling back and forth. Tessa said it was 11 days one way. Caden fell silent. Then he said there was a third way, and that he didn't like it. Tessa asked what it was. He didn't answer. He was thinking about the line with the living specimen and what she'd done to Merton. They'd worked for 2 months straight without a day off. Merton had brought 30 iron casters from the island, and they'd been laying pipes through the streets without sleeping. At first, the people of home were afraid of them and hid their children, but by the 3rd day, they stopped. By the end of the 2nd week, the children were riding on top of them, and Merton would curse and pretend to be angry. All 23 men from Olshoven arrived. Caden hadn't called them. Half of the men from home also came, and they worked for free because they could see what was being laid. Caden was digging trenches through the streets, and he was no longer working at a pace of 1 step per hour. He had a 10 million barrel supply, and he was spending it like water. He covered 412 streets in 51 days. By the end of the 2nd month, Holm had been completely dug up, and the pipes were full of water. Caden turned it on for the first time at the end of the month when the first snow fell. He sat in the grain silo, opened the valve, and the water began to flow. He sat there and listened. An hour later, people in the street began to shout. He went outside. All along the street, people were touching the boxes against their walls, and the boxes were hot. Caden stood on the porch watching this, and Tessa stood beside him. And suddenly he realized he felt nothing. Nothing at all. He watched the people warming their hands against the wall of their own homes for the first time in 3 years. And inside him, there was a void. He turned and went back into the granary and sat down on the floor by the barrel. Tessa found him an hour later, sitting in the dark. She asked what was wrong. He said he didn't know. He said he should be happy. He said he couldn't. He said that for the whole year he'd been watching the meter, and now that the meter wasn't needed anymore, he felt empty inside. Tessa sat down next to him on the floor and said one thing that he would remember for a very long time. She said that for a year hadn't let go of the stone. She said he slept on hot surfaces and ate on hot surfaces, and that the ring on his finger was cold, yet he hadn't taken it off even once in 14 months. She asked when he had last felt anything. Caden sat there in silence. Then he said he didn't remember. He said he remembered only numbers. He looked at his wrist in the darkness and tried to pull the ring off for the first time. It didn't budge. It wasn't just on his finger. It was part of his hand. The first winter in Holm lasted 61 days until the turning point. And during those 61 days, Caden went to the island twice and brought back 2 barrels. The 3rd time, he was too late. The frost struck on the longest night, and the water in the pipes on the 3 farthest streets had frozen by morning. Caden found out about this at noon. He ran all the way across town, and when he arrived, Merton's men were already there, warming the pipe by hand with stones, and they'd made it in time. No one died. Caden sat in the snow next to the dug-up pipe shivering, and he realized that this hadn't been a miscalculation. It was an accident. He'd been lucky. That evening, he told Tessa that things couldn't go on like this. He said that the entire province depended on whether he'd managed to make it through the 11 days or not. He said that if he broke his leg, it would mean the deaths of 1,400 people. He said he'd finally understood what Crane meant when he called it a noose around everyone's neck. He said he hadn't built warmth. He'd built dependence on himself. And he said he knew how to fix it and that he was afraid. Caden waited until the end of winter, and no one in Holm died. Not a single person. Crane arrived alone at the beginning of spring and walked around town for 2 days without saying a word. On the third day, he sat down in the granary across from the barrel and said that in 40 years, he hadn't seen a single province with 0 deaths. He said that even in the capital, 400 people die in the winter. He took out a piece of paper, wrote the number on it, stamped it, and Kaiden stared at that 0 and felt nothing again. Crane noticed and asked what was wrong with him. Caden told the truth. He said he felt nothing. Crane looked at him intently and said he'd seen this in people who had been working with numbers for 30 years. He said that a person becomes their work. He said he was like that himself, and that his wife had left him when he was 34, and that he hadn't felt anything about that either. He said the boy was 19 and that it was too early. Then he asked why he'd actually been summoned. Caden said he was asking for a second signature. He said he was asking for authorization for the 7 northern provinces. Crane laughed for the first since they'd met. He said the boy didn't understand. He said that after Holm, he didn't need anyone's permission. He said that the number 0 had already been passed by the council and that 3 houses had written him letters with offers. He said that House Askell had withdrawn its claim to the island yesterday. Caden asked why. Crane said because it was pointless now. He said you couldn't take an island away from a man who had cancelled winter in an entire province. He said this was no longer a dispute over land. He said that now Askell would do something else. He said that now Askell would make sure the boy died. Caden asked how. Crane said not how. He said when. He said by next winter. He said that was the only window of opportunity, because in winter, half the kingdom would be keeping an eye on the boy, but in summer, no one needed him. Caden returned to the island at the beginning of summer, and the island wasn't the same one he'd left behind. Over the winter, Tessa had brought another 140 people. Merton had dug a second pit. There were nearly 100 ironmen. Ships were sailing around the bay, and on the shore stood a warehouse, and inside the warehouse were barrels ready for shipment. Caden walked through his settlement, and people greeted him, though he didn't recognize half of them by sight. He reached the black box he'd cast during his first week there and sat down on the threshold. Merton came over and sat down beside him, and they were silent for a long time. Then Merton said the boy was starting to look unwell. Caden said he knew. Merton said it wasn't about his face. He said it was about the way he looked at things. He said the boy looked at people as if they were numbers, and that he used to do the same sometimes, but now it was always like that. He said he'd seen this in a master who'd worked at the furnace for 40 years, and in the end couldn't fall asleep without the heat, and died in his own home in the winter because he'd forgotten to light the fire. Caden listened. Then he told Merton that he wanted to ask him as a person, not as a master. He asked what Merton had felt when the skill was taken from him. Merton thought for a moment and said he felt lighter. He said he'd carried it inside him for 22 years and had been afraid of forgetting it. But now he was no longer afraid. Caden asked if he wasn't sorry to lose it. Merton said it would have been a shame if it had disappeared. He said it hadn't disappeared. He pointed to the pit where the iron ones used to walk and said it was there. Caden sat and looked at the pit and at the 100 black figures who were doing the same thing that one cripple had done, and they did it around the clock. He told Merton that he had made up his mind. Merton asked what. Caden said he would take it off. Merton was silent for a long time. Then he asked why. Caden explained and kept explaining for an hour. He said the entire system depended on him alone. He said that if he died, everything would come to a halt. He said they'd kill him in the summer because it was the only way to get the coal back. He said he was the only weak point on his island. He said that if they took his ability away and put it into the iron, there'd be no reason to kill him. Merton said the boy would then be nothing. Caden said yes. Merton said he'd lose everything. Caden said no. He said he'd only lose the counter. He said the island would remain, the people would remain, the pit would remain. He said the numbers would cease to be his numbers and would simply become numbers. Merton sat there for a long time and then said there was one thing he didn't understand. He asked if the boy wanted to remove the power from himself or remove the ring. Caden didn't answer. He tried that very night. He sat alone by the pit, opened the form knot, and found the sixth line. A living sample is required. He placed his hand on his chest and said yes. Nothing happened. He tried again. Nothing. The line didn't fade or argue. It simply didn't work. He sat there for an hour, trying everything he could think of. And then he realized. The specimen had to be someone else, not him. The system couldn't extract a skill from the host, because the host was the system itself. Caden sat on a rock and laughed out loud, and that wasn't good. He laughed because he'd realized something very simple. He could extract 22 years from the foundry worker. He could extract a skill from anyone. He couldn't extract himself from himself. The ring wasn't a tool. The ring was him. In the morning, he called Tessa and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and at the end, she said she was glad. Caden was surprised. She said she'd been afraid all year that he'd do it. She said he wouldn't have done it for the sake of others. She said he would have done it to finally stop. Caden asked, "Stop what?" Tessa said, "Stop being." She said that a person who hasn't gotten up from a hot stone for a year, not because he can't, but because the number keeps growing, is a person who doesn't like being human. She said that stripping oneself of power is the most honest way to kill oneself and remain alive. She said she wouldn't let him. Caden sat in silence for a very long time, and then said he hadn't known that about himself. Tessa said she knew. In the summer, they came for him. Not assassins. 3 men came, and they had papers from 3 houses, and they made offers. The first offered to buy the island for 200,000 silver coins. Caden refused. The second offered a partnership and 1/10 of the royal council. Caden refused. The third offered nothing. The third man said that House Askell was asking for one thing. House Askell was asking that the boy not install pipes in the 7 northern provinces for the next 5 years. House Askell was willing to pay any price. Caden asked why 5. The man said that in 5 years, House Askell would sell off the mining concessions. Caden said he understood. He said that in that case, about 7,000 people would die of the cold in the 7 provinces over the next 5 years. He asked the man if he knew that figure. The man said he did. He said the figure was acceptable. Caden sent him away. That evening, he sat with Tessa and Merton and said that was it. He said that after a conversation like that, it wasn't envoys who would be coming. He said they needed to prepare. Merton asked for what? Caden said he didn't know. He said that Askell had 8,000 soldiers and ships. He said he had 100 iron casters who knew nothing but casting. He said he had 35 men and 140 new recruits who had never fought before. He said that if Askell came here, he'd take the island in a day. Merton said that in that case, they had to make coming here cost more than the island itself. Caden asked how. Merton said that the boy had been pretending for a year not to understand one thing, and that it was time to stop. He said that the boy had a program that took a living specimen and cast it in iron. He said the boy had chosen the foundryman because the foundryman was at hand. He said the foundryman wasn't the only person in the world. Caden understood, and a chill ran down his spine. Merton said aloud what Caden had been thinking for half a year, but hadn't allowed himself to think through. He said that if you take a soldier, you get a soldier. Caden said no that very night and repeated it in the morning. And Merton didn't argue. He simply asked, "What then?" Caden said he didn't know, and that was true for 3 days. On the 4th day, he gathered everyone who was on the island. There were 178 of them. He stood on a barrel, just as he had once done in Olshaven, and spoke plainly. He said that the house of Askel would arrive here before winter. He said they had 8,000 soldiers. He said that if they landed, they would take the island in a day, and that he wouldn't be able to stop them. He said he wouldn't hold anyone back. He said the boats were waiting in the cove and that they could leave today, and that he would give money to anyone who left. He stood there and waited. No one left. Caden stood on the barrel and looked at the 178 people, and for the first time in a year and a half, he felt something. And it was so unexpected that he fell silent mid-sentence. Tessa said later that he stood like that for almost a minute. That evening, the man from Olshaven, the one missing 2 fingers and whose 2 children had died that winter, came to him. His name was Hald. He said he was speaking for all the newcomers. He said they hadn't stayed out of nobility. He said they'd done the math. He said that if the island were taken, they'd return to the harbor where winter awaited them. He said they had nothing to lose here because they'd already lost everything before they even arrived. He said it wasn't bravery. He said it was arithmetic. Caden listened and realized that this was the wisest thing anyone had ever said to him. He wasn't raising an army. He was gathering everyone who had nowhere else to go. They prepared for 40 days. Caden didn't build walls. He did the math and realized that a wall was foolish. 8,000 people could take down any wall that could be built in 40 days. He did something else. He took the Ruslo knot and went to look at the mountain. He stared at it for 2 days. He watched the tongue of lava flow. He looked at the old layers of solidified lava. He counted them and remembered how he had counted them on the first day and lost count at 17. He climbed higher than ever before and made his way to the very mouth of the crater, standing there behind a small wall while Tessa counted aloud to 200. And there he saw what he'd been looking for. There wasn't just one vent. It was blocked. On the eastern side of the crater was an old plug of solidified rock, and behind it lay a lake. It was 400 paces above the level of the village. Caden climbed down, sat down, and counted all night long. He calculated that if the plug were removed, the lava would flow down the eastern slope. He calculated exactly where. He calculated that it would reach the cove in 9 hours. He calculated that the cove would become impassable for 2 years. He calculated that the village, both pits, all the pipes, warehouses, and houses would be right in its path. Everything he'd been building for 14 months. He sat with those figures until morning. In the morning, he called Tessa and Merton over and showed them his calculations. Tessa understood immediately and said he'd gone crazy. Merton looked at them for a long time and then said he understood and that it was correct. Caden explained it to the rest of them that evening. He said he wouldn't fight for the island. He said that if Askel entered the bay, he would turn the mountain. He said that no one would get the island. He said that all his power lay in one thing. He said he could give back what he had taken. Hald asked, "What about them?" Caden said they would leave earlier. He said everyone would go to Holm. He said he would stay behind alone, turn the mountain, and leave last, and that he would make it in 9 hours. Tessa stood up and said no. She said he wouldn't make it in time and that he knew it. She said he was counting again and that nowhere in his calculations was there a line for where he lived. Caden was silent. She was right. He had counted 40 days, and not once had he counted himself. Askel arrived at the end of summer. Not 8,000. He brought 16 ships carrying about 2,000 men, and Caden realized this wasn't even a war. It was a cleanup operation. They didn't consider the island an enemy. The ships anchored in the roadstead 3 leagues away and didn't enter. Caden watched them from the ridge all day and couldn't understand. By evening, a boat with a white flag pulled away from them, and in the boat, Askell himself. He came ashore, and Caden saw him up close for the first time since that square. He was just the same as ever, straight back, a calm face. He looked at the settlement, the pits, and the smoke, and said it was impressive. He said he wouldn't land. Caden asked why. Askell said he'd done the math. He said a landing would mean 2,000 soldiers, casualties, a scandal in the council, and the 0 figure from home that everyone had read about. He said it was too expensive. He said he'd found a cheaper option. He pulled out a piece of paper. He said it was the deed to the province of Home. He said he'd bought it from the crown the day before yesterday for 140,000 silver coins. He said that Home was now his land. He said that the pipes in Home had been laid without the owner's permission. He said that, as the owner, he had the right to remove another's property from his land. He said he'd already given the order. He said the pipes would be dismantled by the first snowfall. Caden stood there, unable to say a word. Askell put the paper away and said one last thing. He said the boy could keep sitting on his rock for as long as he wanted. He said he wouldn't bother him anymore. He said that heat with nowhere to go is just a hot rock. He got into the boat and sailed away. And by morning, 16 ships had left, without firing a single shot. Caden sat on the shore until dawn. Tessa found him there. He told her he had lost. He said he'd been building in the wrong direction all year. He said he'd been treating heat as a commodity when he should have been doing something else. He said Askell had figured it out before he did. He said that heat with nowhere to go is nothing, and that all the places belong to people like Askell, and that Askell would buy them all, one by one, faster than Caden could lay a pipe. Tessa sat beside him and said nothing. Then she said he was miscalculating again. Caden said he was tired. She said he was counting places. She said there were an infinite number of places, and that true, you couldn't buy them all, but Askell didn't need to. She said Askell hadn't bought Home. She said Askell had bought a permit. She said that everything Caden had been doing for the past year and a half, he'd been doing with a permit. A permit from the crown for the land, permission from Crane for the province, permission from the guildmaster to trade. She said he's the most powerful man in the kingdom, yet he's always asking someone for... Caden raised his head. She said that he still acts like that little boy in the square who stands in a line of 300 people waiting for them to give him a token. She said that he took the last token and built something out of it that no one else has, and he's still standing in line. Caden sat there staring at the water and suddenly laughed. Tessa asked what? Caden said he understood. He said he'd been wrong about the same thing for 14 months, and it was the same with the pebbles. He said they'd told him 200, and he'd carried water in thimbles for a year. He said they'd told him island, and he'd spent a year on an island. He stood up. Tessa asked what he was going to do. Caden said he would stop asking. He said he would go to Vern, not to Crane. He said he would go to the king. He said he wouldn't ask for anything. He said he would propose one thing, and that if the king refused, he would turn around and leave. And in a year, the king would no longer have a kingdom, but only a cold land, with people who knew whose stone had warmed them. Tessa asked what he would propose. Caden said he would propose the same thing he had proposed to Crane on that first evening. He said that back then he had said it like an honest fool. He said that now he would say it as a threat. It took Caden 12 days to reach Vern, and he remained silent the entire way. Tessa rode alongside him and kept to herself. Merton stayed on the island, and Caden told him one thing as they parted. He said that if he didn't return in a month, Merton shouldn't turn the mountain. He said to just let everyone leave. Merton asked, "What about the island?" Caden said that the island was just a rock. He said the rock wasn't going anywhere, and that it was burning not for them, but for everyone. Merton looked at him and said that the boy had finally said something smart. They arrived in Vern in mid-fall. The snow hadn't fallen yet, but you could already smell it. Crane received him that same day, his face ashen. He said he hadn't been able to stop it. He said the deed had been signed by the council in a single night and that he'd been the last to find out. He said he'd maintained the winter stockpile for 31 years and that they'd bypassed him in a single night because he was a clerk, while Askell was a quarter of the council. Caden said that wasn't why he'd come. He said he was asking for one thing. He asked for an audience to be arranged for him. Crane laughed and said it was impossible. He said that the king isn't informed about the barons of the wasteland. Caden said he wasn't a baron from the wasteland. He told Crane to pass on a single line. He told him to say that the owner of Calder was asking for a quarter of an hour, and that in a year he would leave the continent. Crane looked at him and asked where he would go. Caden said across the sea. He said the heat was the same everywhere. He said there were mountains, not only here. Crane sat in silence for about 3 minutes. Then he stood up and said he would try. The audience was granted 9 days later, which was very quick. Caden entered the hall. It was enormous, and there were about 60 people standing inside. The first person he saw was Askell. He was standing by the left wall, looking at him calmly. The king wasn't old. He was about 45. He had an intelligent, weary face, and Caden realized at first glance that this man didn't give anything away for free. Caden bowed, and the king said that a strange message had been relayed to him. He said that Baron Caldera was planning to leave the continent. He asked why then the Baron was standing there instead of sailing away. Caden said he had come to propose an exchange. Someone in the hall laughed. The king wasn't laughing. Caden began to speak and spoke for 7 minutes, using only numbers. He said that last winter, according to Crane's records, 2,200 people had died of the cold in the kingdom. He said that in the province of Holm, 0 people had died last winter. He said that previously, 1,400 had died. He said that one man had accomplished this from a single island in 4 months, at his own expense. He said that the province of Holm had been sold to the house of Askell the day before yesterday, that the pipes would be dismantled before the snow fell, and that this winter, 1,400 people would die there again. He said that this was recorded in a document bearing the royal seal, and that the document had been signed by the keeper of the winter reserves. He said he wasn't complaining. He said he was simply stating the facts. Then he said the most important thing. He said he was offering the following to the crown. He said he was giving away a method, not an island, not stones. A method. He said he had the ability to extract a skill from a person and imbue it into iron. He said he had already done this with the foundryman. He said he was ready to do it with anyone the crown appointed. He said that then any craftsman would be able to install pipes, and anyone would be able to retain heat, and that in 10 years, the entire kingdom would know how to do it. He said he was asking for only one thing in return. He didn't ask for an island. He didn't ask for a title. He asked for a law. He said he was asking to have it written into law that heat could belong to no one. He said he was asking to have it written into law that no one could forbid a pipe from being laid across their land if the pipe was leading to the people. He said he was asking to have it written into law that a tax on heat was forbidden. The hall fell silent. Askell stood motionless by the wall. The king sat and looked at Caden, then asked one question, and Caden realized that this man was smarter than anyone else in the hall. He asked what would happen to Baron Caldera if such a law were passed. Caden said that Baron Caldera would no longer be needed. He said that in 10 years any workshop would be able to make his stone. He said he would remain the owner of the hot rock in the middle of the strait. The king asked why he needed that. Caden stood in the hall with 60 people and answered honestly, because he had no other choice. He said he'd been counting units for a year and a half. He said he'd learned to transform heat into anything. He said he hadn't learned to transform it back into himself. He said he hadn't felt anything since last winter. He said he'd stood on the street in Holm and watched as people warmed their hands against the wall for the first time in 3 years. And he felt nothing. and that it frightened him more than a volcano. He said that if he kept holding it in his hands any longer, he would become a counter entirely. He said he wanted to give it away, while there was still something left to give. He said it wasn't nobility. He said it was the only way left for him to remain human. The hall was very quiet. Then Askel stepped away from the wall and said that the Baron spoke beautifully, but that the Baron was proposing that the crown destroy the entire fuel trade in the kingdom. He said that this meant 30,000 people who made their living from coal. He said that these were his mines and the mines of 4 other houses, as well as the Carters and the Ports. He said that the Baron was proposing to kill 30,000 for the sake of 2. Caden turned to him and said that the figure was acceptable. He said it in exactly the same words that Askel's ambassador had used that summer when speaking of 7,000 dead. Askel understood, and for the first time ever, his face twitched. Caden said that 30,000 coal miners would not die. He said they would go lay pipes. He said there would be enough work to last 100 years. He said the coal was running out, but the mountain wasn't. The king listened and said nothing. Then he asked Askel one thing. He asked how much Askel had paid for Holm. Askel said 140,000. The king asked how much he expected to recoup in tolls for the pass over 5 years. Askel remained silent. The king said that according to his council's records, the figure came to 400,000. He said that wasn't bad. Then he said that, according to Crane's records, about 7,000 people would die in the 7 northern provinces over those same 5 years. He said that each of them would have paid taxes for 40 years.
He counted aloud, and the figure came out to be 6 times greater than 400,000. He said that the house of Askel was offering the crown a loss and calling it trade. He said this calmly and without malice, and Caden realized that this man had been calculating in the same way as he himself his entire life. It was just that no one had ever let him count aloud. The king passed the law that same month. He did not adopt it in its entirety. He accepted 2 of the 3 points. The heat tax was banned. The right to lay pipelines across any land was granted to the crown, not to everyone.
He struck out the 3rd point, that heat could belong to no one, himself, and told Caden in private that one must not write into law what cannot be verified. He said that words like that lead to wars 100 years down the line. Caden agreed. Holm was not returned to Caden. The crown took Holm back and returned Askel's 140,000 to him, and Askel did nothing because there was nothing left to do. The pipes were not dismantled. 2 months later, Caden was sitting in a small, windowless room, and across from him sat 4 people appointed by the crown, 3 craftsmen and 1 engineer. Crane stood by the wall. Caden explained to them once what was going to happen. He said he didn't know if it would hurt. He said that the first person he'd removed it from was still in one piece and working to this day. The first to sit down was an old man of about 70. He was a builder and had been building bridges for 40 years. Caden placed his hand on the old man's shoulder and paid 2 million, and the old man flinched and cried out once, then sat there breathing. Then he said that everything was in place, and at that moment, a line appeared before Caden. It was called the Builder. 50,000 units. He sat there looking at it, realizing what had just happened. He hadn't given up the crown's power. He couldn't give up the ring. He had given up something else. He had given up what the ring couldn't take away. He looked at the 4 masters and understood a simple thing he hadn't grasped for a year and a half. The system didn't create anything. It only redistributed. It had always only redistributed. So all he had was what had already been in the people before him. Merton's 22 years. This old man's 40 years. He wasn't the source. He was a conduit. Caden returned to the island in the spring. He sailed alone because Tessa had stayed in Verna for 2 months to install pipes in the lower city and had written that she would return by summer. The island was visible from afar, and a column of smoke rose above it, straight and steady, just as it had on the very first day. Caden stood at the bow of the black boat and looked at it. The mountain was working. It had been working for 100 years before him, and it had been working for the past year and a half while he was counting, and it would continue to work after he was gone. It had never been his. He had simply happened to be nearby
and laid his hand upon it. Merton met him on the shore, and standing with him were about 200 people, half of whom Kaiden didn't know. Merton said that another 100 had arrived over the winter. He said that the second pit was yielding 400 ingots.
He said that 3 people had come from Vern to learn the trade, and that he was putting them through their paces. He said that there were now 140 iron machines, that they'd started breaking down, and that he'd learned how to fix them. Caden walked through the village, taking it all in. Houses, smoke, children. Someone was cursing by the canal. It smelled like stew. He walked over to his black box, which he'd cast during his first week using a rough model made of a splinter, and sat down on the threshold. Merton sat down next to him. They were silent. Then Merton asked what was next. Caden said he didn't know.
He said that for the first time in a year and a half he didn't know, and that it was a good thing. He looked at his wrist. The ring was there. It was cold. He thought that it would stay with him until he died, that he couldn't take it off, that it was true, and that he'd have to live with it. He looked at the counter. 12 million. He sat there staring at the number, waiting for something inside him to stir. Nothing. Then he mentally shut off the counter and raised his head. Evening lay before him. The sea was red from the sunset and the mountain. People were walking along the shore on their way home from work. Someone was carrying a child on their shoulders. Steam was rising from the windows because it was bath day. Merton was nearby, fixing something on his lap and cursing. Caden sat on the threshold of the black house he'd built himself when he was starving to death, watching all this, and suddenly felt something. Not joy, just warmth. Ordinary, like everyone else's. He sat there watching, counting nothing. Behind him, the mountain hummed.